You believe you know your family. I thought I knew mine. They looked right. They sounded right. Everything seemed perfect. The old house smelled the same. It was the first thing I noticed when I stepped through the door. A scent of dried lavender, old paper, and the faint, dusty sweetness of my father's pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked it in years. It was the smell of home, a scent I had yearned for during my first semester away at college. My mother, Alina, stood in the hallway, her arms open for a hug. My father, Mark, stood just behind her, a small, tired smile on his face. Everything was exactly as it should be, a perfect tableau of a son's return. But as my mother's arms wrapped around me, I felt the first dissonant note in the symphony of homecoming. Her embrace was firm, but it lacked warmth. It felt practiced, a precise application of pressure without the familiar, chaotic affection. I knew. We sat for dinner in the dining room, a room reserved for special occasions. The roast chicken sat in the center of the table, perfectly browned, yet the aroma was muted, clinical. My mother had always been a chaotic, passionate cook, her meals a vibrant assault on the senses. This felt different, calculated. My father was quiet, more so than usual. He ate with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his eyes fixed on his plate. He had always been a man of few words, but his silence now felt heavy, vacant. I tried to fill the void, talking about my classes, my new friends, the city. My mother would nod, her head tilting at precise, even intervals. She would ask questions, but they felt like prompts from a script. And did you find the coursework challenging? Have you been eating properly? The words were correct, but the melody was wrong. I tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on my own fatigue, on the strange melancholy of returning to a childhood home that suddenly feels smaller. But the sense of wrongness was a persistent, low hum beneath the floorboards of the evening. It was in the way my mother's knife and fork moved in perfect, parallel strokes. It was in the way my father's gaze never quite met mine, instead landing on a point just over my shoulder. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken things, with a stillness that was not peaceful but predatory. The light from the fixture overhead seemed to dim, casting long, distorted shadows that clung to the corners of the room. I looked at my mother, trying to find the woman who had raised me in her placid, smiling face. It was then, as she turned her head slightly to offer me another piece of chicken, that the low, ambient light caught the side of her face in just the right way. And I saw it. It was not a trick of the light. Along the delicate skin of her eyelid, tracing the socket where her eye sat, was a thin, dark line. It was barely visible, a shadow within a shadow, but it was undeniably there. It looked like a seam, like the kind a doll maker might use to join two pieces of fabric. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, silent gasp. My heart began a frantic, muffled drumming against my ribs. I blinked, hoping the image would resolve back into the familiar landscape of my mother's face, into the soft wrinkles of a woman in her late 40s. But the line remained. It was a fine, black thread, woven into her skin with a horrifying precision. A series of tiny, almost invisible cross-stitches held the edges of her eyelid together, as if it were a garment that could be unfastened. Her eye, the one I could see clearly, was a perfect, warm brown. It was her eye, and yet the skin around it was a lie. I forced myself to look away, my gaze dropping back to my plate. The chicken suddenly looked like carved wax. The silence in the room pressed in on me, no longer just awkward but suffocating. I could feel her watching me. I dared a glance at my father. He was still methodically chewing his food, his jaw moving with a slow, unnatural regularity. His face was in shadow, turned slightly away from the main light. I needed to see. I needed to know if this madness was isolated or if it had spread. My fork clattered against my plate as I accidentally knocked it to the floor. As I bent down to retrieve it, I looked at him from under the table. The angle was different, the light catching the side of his face. And there, peeking out from just beneath the graying hair of his eyebrow, was the same dark, perfect seam. A faint, almost imperceptible line of black thread that disappeared into his skin. My blood ran cold. I was not having dinner with my parents. I was having dinner with the things that wore their faces. Of course, I will now provide the next part of the story. I stayed under the table for a moment that stretched into a cold eternity. The world was muffled and dark. The only sounds, the rhythmic, gentle scraping of cutlery on porcelain from above. It was the sound of a normal dinner, a sound that now seemed like a broadcast from a different, saner reality. A wave of nausea washed over me, hot and acidic. My mind was a storm of raw panic, every instinct screaming at me to crawl out the back door, to run until the pavement wore through my shoes. But I was paralyzed. Running felt like an admission that I knew their secret. And I had no idea what the consequences of that admission would be. I straightened up slowly, the retrieved fork feeling impossibly heavy in my trembling hand. I placed it back on the table, my movements stiff and deliberate. I forced my lips into a shape that I hoped resembled a casual smile. When I lifted my head, they were both looking at me. Their expressions were unchanged, placid, patient, empty. There was no flicker of suspicion in their eyes, no sign that they had registered my terror. This was somehow worse. It was the calm of something that does not need to feel suspicion because it is already in complete control. "There you are," my mother said. Her voice was a perfect imitation of affection, but it was like listening to a recording. The words were hollow vessels, devoid of any genuine emotion. I managed a nod, my throat too tight to form words. I picked up my knife and fork and began to cut another piece of chicken. My hands shook so badly that the knife scored a loud line across the ceramic plate. I focused on the task, on the simple mechanics of eating. I did not look at their faces. I stared at the wood grain of the table, at the pattern on my plate, at anything but the horrific seams that held my parents' faces in place. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of hyperware dread. I answered their questions in monosyllables, my own voice sounding distant and foreign. With every passing second, the illusion of my family shattered further. I started noticing other things, the way they blinked in perfect, unnerving synchronicity, the way my father's head tilted at an angle that seemed just slightly too sharp, too unnatural for human anatomy. They were exquisitely made puppets, and I was their sole, terrified audience. Finally, after what felt like hours, my mother placed her knife and fork down, perfectly aligned on her clean plate. "You must be tired from your journey, Alex," she said. It was not a question. It was a command disguised as a kindness. My father nodded in agreement, his head moving with that same unnervingly precise motion. Relief, cold and sharp, pierced through my fear. It was my chance, an escape. "Yes," I said, my voice cracking. "I am very tired." I stood up, my chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Thank you for dinner. It was wonderful." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. I turned and walked out of the dining room, not daring to look back, every nerve in my body screaming that two pairs of motionless, inhuman eyes were following my every step up the stairs. My old room was a sanctuary of the past, a museum of a life that no longer felt like my own. The posters on the wall, the worn-out books on the shelf, the faint indentation on the carpet where my desk chair used to sit. It was all real. It was all mine. I closed the door, my hand shaking so much I could barely turn the old brass knob. I did not dare to lock it, fearing the sound would be too loud, too definitive. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. I could hear them clearing the table downstairs. The clinking of plates and silverware was rhythmic, efficient, and unnervingly quiet. There was no conversation, no clatter of a dropped spoon, none of the small chaotic noises of a real family cleaning up after a meal. It was the sound of a machine performing a task. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to leave. The thought was a raw, primal urge. I looked at the window. It was a straight drop, 2 stories, down to the manicured lawn below. Too risky. The front door was impossible. They were downstairs. The back door, through the kitchen, was equally out of the question. I was trapped. I sank onto my bed, the old springs groaning in protest. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I had to call someone, the police. What would I say? That my parents had seams on their faces, that they blinked in unison. They would think I was having a psychotic break. My friends, they were hours away, back near campus. What could they do? My thumb hovered over the emergency call button, a bead of sweat tracing a cold path down my temple. A soft, scraping sound came from the hallway outside my door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was a slow, dragging noise, like a heavy piece of furniture being pulled across the wooden floor. It stopped directly outside my room. I held my breath, listening to the roaring silence that followed. The doorknob began to turn. It moved with an agonizing slowness, a deliberate, silent rotation that was infinitely more terrifying than a sudden rattle. I scrambled backwards on the bed, my back hitting the cold wall. My eyes were locked on the door, on the small, dark gap that was beginning to appear between the door and its frame. The gap widened, and a thin slice of the dim, upstairs hallway became visible. Then, a shape slid into the gap. It was not a hand or a face. It was a small, white piece of folded paper, pushed silently under my door. The doorknob stopped turning. The paper lay on my floor, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. The scraping sound started again, moving away from my door, back down the hallway, leaving me alone with the silent, ominous message. For a long time, I did not move. I just stared at the folded piece of paper, my mind a blank slate of pure terror. It was a Trojan horse, an object of unknown intent that had breached my only defense. The silence of the house pressed in, no longer empty but filled with a watchful, patient presence. Every creak of the old house was a footstep. Every whisper of wind against the window was a voice. My own breathing was a frantic, loud betrayal. In the quiet, finally, a desperate, morbid curiosity won out over my paralysis. My limbs felt disconnected, as if I were piloting a body that was not my own. I slid off the bed, my socked feet making no sound on the floorboards. I crept towards the door, my movements slow and measured, as if a single sudden motion would trigger a trap. I knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached for the paper. It was cool to the touch, a simple piece of printer paper folded neatly in half. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs as I unfolded it. The message inside was not handwritten. It was typed in a clean, impersonal font, the same kind you would find on an office memo. The words were simple and utterly horrifying. We know you see the stitches. Do not make us replace the eyes. The message was a clean, declarative statement. There was no threat of violence, no anger. There was only a calm, cold instruction, a statement of fact from an entity that knew it held all the power. They were not trying to deceive me anymore. They were telling me the rules of the game. My mind reeled. Replace the eyes. The phrase echoed in the silent room, conjuring images of buttons and coarse black thread. That was the price of my knowledge. Compliance for the privilege of keeping my own sight. A sudden wave of rage, hot and sharp, cut through my fear. It was an indignation born of absolute terror. How dare they? How dare these things wear the faces of my parents and issue commands from behind their stolen smiles? I stood up, the paper crumpled in my fist. I had to get out. The risk of the window no longer seemed so great. It was a chance, however slim. I moved to the window, my hands working at the old, stiff latch. It was painted shut, sealed by years of seasonal expansion and my father's indifference to minor repairs. I pulled and pushed, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but it wouldn't budge. I looked around the room, frantic, searching for something, anything to use as a tool. My gaze fell on a heavy trophy from my high school days, a small metal figure on a solid marble base. It was heavy, heavy enough. I picked it up, the cold weight of it a small comfort in my hand. I took a deep breath, raised it high, and prepared to shatter the glass, to trade the silent, watchful prison for the chaos of the outside world. Just as I was about to swing, a voice spoke from directly behind me. It was my mother's voice, but it was flat, devoid of warmth, and impossibly close. That would be a mistake, Alex. I froze, the heavy trophy held aloft. My entire body went rigid, every muscle locked in place by the impossible sound of her voice. It had come from right behind me, from the empty space between my back and the wall. It was a physical impossibility. I had closed the door. I had heard them downstairs. My skin crawled with 1,000 tiny, cold pinpricks. The trophy suddenly felt like it weighed a ton, my arm trembling under the strain. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my arm and turned. She was standing there, in the middle of the room, not 3 feet away from me. Her posture was placid, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She had not opened the door, she had simply appeared. A quiet fold in the fabric of reality had opened and deposited her there. Her face held the same vacant, pleasant expression as it had at dinner, but now, in the intimacy of my bedroom, it was a mask of pure terror. "We have provided you with shelter," she continued, her voice a monotone stream of syllables. "We have provided you with sustenance. We have maintained this place for you. Breaking the glass would be a violation of the terms." Her head tilted with that same mechanically precise motion, the seam around her eye catching the lamplight. It was not a mother scolding her son. It was a warden reading from a list of regulations. I took a half step back, my heel bumping against the leg of my bed. My eyes darted to the door. Standing in the now open doorway was my father. He was a silent sentinel, his body perfectly framed by the doorway, blocking my only other path. He held a small, black, 4-hole button between his thumb and forefinger, holding it up just enough for me to see. Beside him, on the floor of the hallway, was a small sewing box, open, with a spool of thick, black thread sitting neatly inside. The message was clear. They had not just come to stop me, they had come prepared to enact the punishment. The integrity of the container must be maintained, my father said, his voice as hollow and flat as my mother's. It was the first time he had spoken since dinner. For your sake, as much as for ours. The trophy slipped from my nerveless fingers and landed on the plush carpet with a soft, muffled thud. The sound was pathetic, a final, failed act of defiance. I was a cornered animal, surrounded by hunters who did not need to run. I looked from the woman who wore my mother's face to the man holding the button in the doorway. The choice they had given me was no choice at all. It was an ultimatum. Surrender or be unmade. I slid down, my back scraping against the wall, until I was sitting on the floor, the defeated trophy lying beside me. I was their son again, and this house was my cage. My mother gave a single, satisfied nod. The expression was not one of warmth or relief, but of a process completed, a veritable, stabilized. She turned and walked out of my room, her movements fluid and silent. My father lingered in the doorway for a moment longer. He looked down at the button in his hand, then curled his fingers around it, making it disappear into his fist. He placed the sewing box back on the hall table with quiet precision before pulling my bedroom door gently closed, leaving me once again in my gilded cage. The click of the latch was the sound of a key turning in a lock. I remained on the floor for what felt like hours, the silence of the house seeping into my bones. The fear had not lessened, but it had changed. The hot, frantic panic had cooled into a solid, heavy dread. I was a prisoner, and my captors wore the faces of the two people I had loved most in the world. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon, a calculated aroma of domestic bliss. For a delirious second, everything felt normal. Then the memory of the stitches, the button, and the cold, flat voices crashed back down on me. I knew what was expected of me. I had to go downstairs. I had to play my part. Walking down the stairs was the hardest thing I have ever done. Each step was a conscious effort not to turn and run back to a room that offered no safety. They were in the kitchen, just as they would have been on any other Saturday morning. My father was reading the newspaper, or pretending to. My mother was at the stove, flipping a pancake. "Good morning, Alex," she chirped, her voice a perfect imitation of motherly cheer. "I hope you slept well." I forced a smile. Like a rock, I lied. Breakfast was a masterpiece of silent tension. I ate the perfectly round, perfectly cooked pancakes, my movements slow and deliberate. I was acting. I was performing the role of a loving son for an audience of two. I watched them from the corner of my eye, studying them, searching for a flaw, a weakness, a crack in their flawless facade. They ate, they drank their coffee, they turned the pages of the newspaper, but they were too perfect, too clean. They never dropped a crumb, they never spilled a drop. And then I noticed something that made the food in my stomach turn to lead. Throughout the entire meal, sitting across the small kitchen table from me, neither one of them took a single breath. Their chests did not rise or fall. They were perfect, silent, unbreathing statues, animated by some unseen, unknowable force. The performance continued all day. I was an actor in a one-man play for an audience of two. I helped my mother with the dishes, my hands moving in the warm, soapy water, just inches from hers. I felt the unnatural stillness of her body, the complete lack of the tiny, fidgeting movements that all living people make. Later, I sat in the living room while my father read his newspaper. I watched him turn a page. The motion was too smooth, too economical. There was no rustle of hesitation, no fumbling with the large, unwieldy paper. It was the movement of a machine built for that specific task. They did not seem to want anything from me but my presence. My quiet, compliant, terrified presence. They were like scientists observing a captured specimen, ensuring the environment was stable so as not to distress the creature they studied. In the afternoon, my mother approached me. She was holding a dusty, leather-bound photo album. I thought, "It would be nice to look at these," she said, her voice a pleasant, empty melody. To remember, she sat on the sofa next to me, the cushion barely dipping under her weight. She opened the album to the first page. It was a picture of my real parents on their wedding day. A picture of two young, vibrant people filled with a light that these creatures could only mimic. She pointed a slender, steady finger at the photo. "We were so happy then," she said. It was a perfect line, delivered with chilling precision. But as she said it, I noticed her finger was resting on my father's face in the photograph, and under the faint pressure of her touch, the glossy surface of the photo began to darken and smudge. The ink of my father's smile dissolving as if touched by a chemical solvent, leaving a black, ugly smear where his face used to be. She did not seem to notice, or if she did not care. She turned the page. It was a picture of me as a toddler, held in my mother's arms on a bright, sunny day at the beach. "You were always such a handful," she said, tapping the photo of my younger self. Again, the image beneath her finger began to corrupt. The bright colors of my childhood faded to a murky gray, the smiling face of the boy I once was distorting into a grimacing, unrecognizable mask. A cold realization washed over me. They were not just imitating my family, they were erasing them. With every touch, with every remembered moment, they were overwriting the past, consuming the memories and leaving nothing but a void in their place. They were feeding on my history, and I was being forced to watch. A wave of vertigo swept over me, so profound that the room seemed to tilt on its axis. I slammed the photo album shut, the sound a sharp crack in the quiet living room. The creature beside me stopped, her hand hovering over the closed book, her head swiveled to face me, the motion smooth and insect-like. "Is something wrong, Alex?" she asked, her voice perfectly even, a placid inquiry that held the weight of a loaded gun. I don't feel well," I stammered, the words tasting real for the first time that day. "My head is pounding. I think I need to lie down." The lie came easily, a desperate shield against the abyss that had just opened up in front of me. They were not just wearing my parents' skin. They were devouring my life, digesting my past one photograph at a time. For a moment, she just stared at me with her one human eye and one black, soulless button. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, my every twitch and bead of sweat being analyzed and recorded. I expected her to deny my request, to force me to continue this grotesque ritual of erasure. But then she nodded slowly. "Of course, you should rest. We want you to be comfortable." The word comfortable was a chilling mockery, a lie so profound. It was almost admirable. She stood, and I scrambled to my feet, backing away towards the stairs. "I'll be in my room," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned and fled up the stairs, not running, but moving with a controlled speed that I hoped conveyed illness rather than sheer, abject terror. I did not look back to see if they were watching. I knew they were. Once inside my room, I leaned against the closed door, my body trembling uncontrollably. My mind was racing. They were feeding on the artifacts of my past. This meant that any physical object tied to a memory was a potential target, a meal for these things. But it also meant something else. It meant the fight was not about escaping the house. The fight was about preserving my own history, my own identity. If they erased every trace of the real Alina and Mark, what would happen to me? Would I forget them? Would my own memories be rewritten until I believed these things were my real parents? The thought was more terrifying than any physical threat. I began to search my room, not for a weapon, but for an anchor. I dug through old drawers, through boxes in the back of my closet, pushing past clothes and forgotten textbooks. I was looking for something they had not found. Something small, something pure. Tucked inside an old novel, I found it. A single, faded Polaroid picture. It was me and my real father, standing by a lake, both of us grinning, him holding up a tiny fish on a line. It was a silly, unimportant moment, but it was real. I held the small, square photograph in my hand, a fragile shield against the things downstairs, and I wondered if my memory, my love for the man in that picture, was strong enough to protect it from their hunger. I held the small photograph like a holy relic, my thumb tracing the faded image of my father's smile. I needed to hide it, but I knew it was useless. If they could corrupt photos in an album right in front of me, they could surely sense this one from anywhere in the house. My only defense was not to hide the object, but to fortify the memory it represented. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the Polaroid, forcing myself to remember. I pushed past the fog of fear and summoned the details. The sharp, clean scent of pine needles from the surrounding woods, the feeling of the warm, sun-baked rock I was sitting on, the sound of my father's laugh, a genuine, booming sound, so different from the hollow silence of the thing downstairs. I focused on the tiny fish, remembering how we had both laughed at its size before letting it go. I poured all my focus, all my love for my real father, into that single, insignificant moment, trying to make the memory so dense, so real, that it would be indigestible to them. As I did this, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew heavy and cold, the kind of deep, unnatural chill that has nothing to do with weather. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. It was the sound of a great machine turning on, of a predator awakening to the scent of prey. They knew they could feel me resisting. They could sense the memory I was clinging to, and they did not like it. The hum grew slightly louder, a constant, oppressive pressure that made my teeth ache. I clutched the photograph tighter, my knuckles white. This was the battleground now, not the house, but the landscape of my own mind. Then came the footsteps on the stairs. They were slow and light, the measured tread of my mother. I scrambled to my feet, shoving the Polaroid into my pocket, my heart hammering against my chest. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Silence, a long, drawn-out moment where the only sound was the humming in the floor and the blood roaring in my ears. Then, a soft knock, a gentle rap of knuckles on wood. I held my breath, praying she would go away, but her voice slid through the door, as sweet and poisonous as nectar. "Alex, dear, I was just tidying up, and I found your father's old fishing lures. It made me think of that trip we took when you were little, the one to the lake. Do you remember?" I was trying to recall what he named that silly little boat we rented. Can you help your mother remember? I felt the blood drain from my face. There had been no boat. We had fished from the shore. It was a trap. A question designed to make me access the memory, to open the door in my mind so she could reach in and take it. My throat felt like it was full of sand. The air in the room was thick with the humming pressure, a physical weight pushing against me. Her question hung in the silence, a carefully crafted lure. If I said there was no boat, I would be calling her a liar, an act of open rebellion. If I said I could not remember, I would be admitting the memory was weak, vulnerable, ready to be overwritten. A third path appeared in my mind, a treacherous, narrow bridge over a chasm of fear. A lie for a lie. It was a gamble, a desperate countermove in a game I was only just beginning to understand. I walked to the door, my hand resting on the cold brass knob, not opening it, but using it as an anchor. I cleared my throat, praying my voice would come out steady. The minnow, I said, the word feeling strange and foreign on my tongue. We called it the minnow, because of that tiny fish you always said Dad was so proud of. I added the detail deliberately, weaving a thread of truth into the fabric of the fiction, hoping to make it stronger. For a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence from the other side of the door. The humming and the floorboards faltered, then died completely. The oppressive pressure in the room vanished, leaving a ringing stillness in its wake. I had called her bluff. She could not challenge my answer without admitting that she had no access to the real memory, that her knowledge was a hollow shell. Then her voice came again, and the cheerfulness had been replaced by something else. A thin, glassy quality, like ice forming on a window pane. That's right, the minnow I had forgotten. You have such a good memory, Alex. It's important to hold on to the good memories. It was a compliment that felt like a threat, a concession that felt like a warning. I heard her footsteps retreat down the stairs, slow and deliberate. I was left alone in the sudden, profound quiet. I pulled the Polaroid from my pocket. The image was unchanged. The smiles of the boy and the man were still there, faint but defiant. A wave of exhilaration, fierce and sharp, cut through my fear. I had one. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve, but it was a victory nonetheless. And it had given me a weapon. If they were trying to erase my past, I would fight them not with the truth, but with fiction. I would build a fortress of false memories around the real ones. A labyrinth of lies where they would get lost, and where the truth of who I was and who my parents were could hide. The rest of the night passed in a state of hypervigilant quiet. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark, the small Polaroid a talisman in my hand, my mind racing to build the walls of my fictional past higher and stronger. I invented stories, weaving intricate lies around every true memory I possessed. I created a phantom dog named Buster. I imagined a family vacation to a beach that we had never visited. I built a convoluted history of my father's failed attempts at gardening. My mind became a fortress of falsehoods, a labyrinth designed to confuse and repel the psychic invaders who wore my parents' faces. For the first time since I arrived, I felt a sliver of power, a sense of agency in my own private war. I would not let them consume me. I would feed them lies until they choked on them. I must have drifted off eventually, lulled into a shallow, uneasy sleep by pure exhaustion. When I awoke, the first thing I noticed was the light. It was wrong. The morning sun that streamed through my window was filtered through a strange, sickly yellow haze. I sat up, my body stiff, and looked around my room. My breath hitched in my chest. It was not my room anymore. The familiar, peeling paint on the walls was gone. In its place was a smooth, seamless surface that looked disturbingly like pale, stretched parchment. The posters of my favorite bands were still hanging, but the faces of the musicians had been subtly altered. Their eyes were vacant, their mouths fixed in placid, identical smiles. My bookshelf was still there, but the titles on the spines of the books had been replaced with repetitive, meaningless symbols. My fortress had been breached. While I had been building defenses in my mind, they had been remodeling my reality. A quiet, declarative footstep sounded in the hallway, and my door swung open. Both of them stood there, side by side. "Good morning, Alex," my mother said, her voice dripping with false warmth. She gestured around the room with a sweep of her hand. "We felt your space could use some refreshing. A clean slate. It's much tidier now, don't you think?" My father nodded his silent, mechanical agreement. They stepped into the room, their presence desecrating the last space I had considered my own. My mother walked over to a poster of my favorite singer, whose once rebellious sneer had been replaced with a serene, empty smile. She traced the figure with her finger, and this time, the image did not smudge or decay. It remained whole. "He has a much kinder face now," she observed calmly. Then she turned to me, her one human eye boring into mine, the button a black void beside it. "Don't you agree?" My heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. My gaze flickered from the empty, smiling face on the poster to the woman wearing my mother's skin. This was a new kind of test. They were not asking me to remember a past event. They were commanding me to accept a new present, a reality of their own design. To disagree was to declare myself an enemy. To agree was to surrender my soul. I felt the small, square shape of the Polaroid in my pocket, a faint anchor in the swirling madness. The memory of my father's real laugh, the scent of pine needles. It was the only thing left that was truly mine, and it gave me an idea. A terrible, brilliant, desperate idea. I would not attack their new reality. I would critique it. I pushed myself off the bed, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were genuinely considering her question. I walked past her, my eyes scanning the room, not with panic, but with the feigned air of an inspector. "It's clean," I said, my voice carefully neutral, very sterile. I stopped at my old wooden desk. Its surface, once covered in a lifetime of scratches, dents, and ink stains, was now perfectly smooth, a flawless sheet of brown. I ran my hand over the unnaturally perfect finish. "You did a wonderful job," I said, turning to face them. I saw a flicker of satisfaction in my mother's human eye. "I had them, but you missed a spot." I pointed to a specific point on the desk's surface. "Right here," I said, my voice gaining a manufactured confidence. "My initials, and Dad's, we carved them right here when I was 10. MA for Mark, and AA for Alex." Dad said his father did the same with him. "It's a tradition." I stared directly at the creature wearing my father's face as I said it. "You must remember that, Dad. The lie was a living thing, born of desperation and venom, and it landed like a stone in a silent pool." The two of them stopped. For the first time, their perfect, placid synchronicity was broken. The mother creature looked at the father creature. The father creature stared at the spot on the desk where the initials were not. There was no confusion on their faces, no human emotion. There was something far more terrifying. There was a glitch, a momentary freeze, like a computer program that has received a command it cannot process. They were perfect imitators, but they could only imitate what they knew. I had introduced a variable from a past that did not exist, and their entire system faltered. The air in the room grew thick and heavy again, but this time the hum was different. It was discordant, a grating, buzzing noise, like the sound of grinding internal gears. I had found a flaw in their code, and I had a feeling the machine was about to crash. The buzzing intensified, a sound that felt like it was trying to tear the air apart. The pale, parchment-like walls began to shimmer, the illusion wavering like a heat haze on asphalt. The father creature took a clumsy, jerking step toward the desk, its head twitching at an unnatural angle. Its placid expression was gone, replaced by a blank, functional emptiness. It raised a hand and touched the smooth surface where I said the carvings should be, its fingers tracing the non-existent letters. Error, it said. The voice was not my father's. It was a synthesized, metallic rasp, devoid of any human inflection. Data not found. The tradition is a fabrication. The memory is corrupt. At the sound of that cold, artificial voice, the mother creature twitched violently. Her head snapped back, and her one human eye rolled back into her head, showing only white, the carefully stitched seam around her button I began to tear. Dark, viscous, liquid, thick, and black like tar began to ooze from the ripping stitches, dripping down her cheek in a slow, grotesque tear. The illusion was not just crashing, it was breaking apart at the seams. Correction initiated, she hissed, her voice a discordant harmony of my mother's voice and that same metallic rasp. Subject's fabrication is destabilizing the environment. Subject requires recalibration. She took a step towards me, no longer walking, but lurching, her movements jerky and puppet-like, as if the strings holding her together were being cut one by one. I did not wait to see what recalibration meant. I lunged for the trophy I had dropped the night before, my hand closing around the heavy marble base. The thing in my father's skin turned from the desk, its movements now fast and unnaturally fluid. It was between me and the door. The other one, the weeping, tearing thing that had been my mother, was closing in from the side. There was only one way out. I spun around, raised the trophy, and with a scream of pure, unadulterated rage, I brought it down against the window. The glass did not just shatter. It exploded outwards in a shower of glittering shards, the sound a glorious, liberating thunder in the buzzing room. I did not hesitate. I put my hands on the sill and vaulted through the broken frame, ignoring the bite of the glass against my skin. For a terrifying second I was falling, the sickly yellow sky above me, the manicured green lawn rushing up to meet me. Then I hit the ground, hard. The pain was immediate and searing, but it was real. It was the most wonderfully, beautifully real thing I had felt in 2 days. I scrambled to my feet, my ankle screaming in protest, and I ran. I ran without looking back, away from the silent house and the things inside it, leaving behind the empty shell of a life that was no longer mine. I do not know what they were or what they wanted, but I know that somewhere in my pocket is a faded Polaroid of a man and a boy smiling by a lake. And as long as I have that, I have not been erased.